When Maya and Nicole Harrison transferred to the prestigious, predominantly white Crestwood Academy, they anticipated challenges. However, they never foresaw the ordeal that awaited them. From the moment they passed through the manicured entrance, Ethan Blackwood and his group of tormentors made it their sole purpose to make their lives miserable. The sisters endured every demeaning remark, every forceful push, and every hateful slur directed their way. But when the bullying escalated to physical violence, it left the twins with no other recourse. Unbeknownst to their abusers, Maya and Nicole were second-degree black belts, trained by their father, who had instilled in them the principle of never yielding to hatred. The bullies mistakenly believed they had found vulnerable targets, but they couldn't have been more mistaken. Before we delve deeper into this narrative, please let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss tomorrow's compelling story. The morning sun bathed the grounds of Crestwood Academy, casting a bright yet stark light over the immaculate lawns and imposing brick buildings that stood like silent sentinels overseeing the students congregating in small clusters. Everything about the institution exuded wealth and established traditions. From the precisely sculpted topiaries to the meticulously maintained stone pathways, it was as if the school was designed not only for education, but also to constantly remind everyone who walked its grounds of their precise social standing. Maya and Nicole Harrison, walking in unison, felt the weight of this unspoken hierarchy pressing down on them even before they reached the main entrance steps. Their uniforms were immaculate, their posture ramrod straight, and their expressions were composed. Yet, beneath the surface, they could feel the intensity of every gaze that followed their movement, every hushed word that passed between the students they encountered. They were no strangers to stares and whispers, but this was different. More pointed, more frigid. It wasn't mere curiosity. They could discern the distinction. This was the kind of attention that came with preformed judgments, with lines already drawn before they even had the opportunity to speak. It wasn't solely because they were new, nor just because they were twins. It was because they were black, and in this environment, that single fact made them stand out more than anything else. Their father, David Harrison, had prepared them for the possibility of such treatment. He hadn't sugar-coated the realities of the world for them. He had taught them to anticipate moments like these, to carry themselves with strength and dignity, regardless of the challenges they faced. He ensured they were capable of defending themselves if the situation ever demanded it, not only with their words, but also with a level of skill and control uncommon for their age. Still, despite all his guidance, despite years of preparation, entering this institution felt like stepping directly into a visible storm approaching from afar, yet utterly unavoidable. "Check that out," a boy's voice sneered, loud enough for them to hear without any attempt at subtlety. He was leaning against a pillar near the school's entrance. A smug grin stretched across his face as his companions snickered beside him. "Twins," another boy added with a sneer, as if the very word was an insult. "Didn't know they came in matching sets." Maya's eyes flicked in their direction, noting the way they puffed out their chests as if they owned the very ground they stood on. She felt a surge of anger rise within her, but suppressed it just as quickly. Their father's calm, steady voice echoed in her mind. "They want a reaction. Don't give it to them." Nicole's grip on her backpack strap tightened, her knuckles showing white against the dark fabric. But like her sister, she maintained a smooth, unreadable expression. The bond between them transcended words, and she knew Maya shared the same simmering fury beneath the surface, waiting. They didn't need verbal communication to understand each other. They had faced enough together to move as one, to think as one. They continued forward without breaking their stride, their eyes fixed on the doors ahead, ignoring the intensity of the stairs burning into their backs like sunlight magnified through glass. The deeper they walked into the courtyard, the clearer the unspoken message became. This place was not designed for them. The polished floors and towering windows, the gleaming trophy cases, and the proud banners hanging from the walls, All of it felt like a stage set for a play in which they were never intended to have a part. Yet they persisted. "Ignore them," Nicole murmured under her breath, her voice low but steady. It was more of a self-reminder than advice. She didn't look at her sister as she spoke, trusting that Maya would understand without needing to. "I see them," Maya responded, her tone quiet yet sharp beneath the surface. "But I won't give them the satisfaction." They reached the main building's doors, tall and heavy, opening with a soft mechanical whir that felt too smooth for what likely awaited them on the other side. As they stepped inside, the cool blast of air conditioning hit their skin, but it couldn't quell the rising heat within them. The students already gathered in the hallway turned to look, conversations momentarily ceasing as eyes followed the twins through the corridor. Some faces held curiosity, others open hostility, and a few displayed a flicker of something more sinister. Amusement, as if they were anticipating the moment the new girls would stumble and provide them with entertainment. Maya's gaze swept the hallway, reading it like a map of territory marked by invisible boundaries. She noted how the bullies congregated in clusters near the lockers, how the girls whispered behind their manicured nails, casting sidelong glances filled with quiet malice. Every detail registered. Every glance felt like a challenge waiting to be met. They knew this was just the beginning. The looks, the whispers, the cutting words spoken just loudly enough to sting but softly enough to deny if confronted. All of it was merely the prelude to something that would escalate until it could no longer be ignored. But they were prepared. They had faced worse than this. They had trained for storms exactly like this one. Though the sky over Crestwood Academy appeared clear and calm, Maya and Nicole could feel the tension building in the atmosphere, the promise of thunder just beyond the horizon. They would not be the ones to initiate the conflict. Their father had instilled in them better principles than that. But if the storm came to them, they would not retreat. And when it did arrive, it would encounter a force far stronger than it anticipated. The initial days at Crestwood Academy unfolded precisely as Maya and Nicole had expected. However, that didn't make the experience any less burdensome. From the moment they entered their first class, it became evident that every eye was fixed on them, not with welcome or genuine curiosity, but with cold, silent judgment. The classroom itself was orderly and bright, sunlight streaming across clean desks and reflecting off polished floors. Yet, no amount of light could mask the way the students, and even some of the teachers, treated them as if they were out of place. Teachers called their names without looking up, their voices monotone, their attention already drifting away as if the twins were nothing more than entries on the attendance roster. In the hallways, the flow of students seemed to subtly shift to obstruct their path, forcing them to step aside or slow down, all while feigning accidental contact. It was deliberate. They knew it, and the students around them knew it too. But Maya and Nicole refused to give them the reaction they sought. They held their heads high, moved with purpose, and didn't allow the underlying tension to push them into isolation. Even as the stares lingered longer and the whispers grew sharper, they navigated each day with unwavering composure and silence. It wasn't long before Ethan Blackwood made his presence known. He was hard to miss, acting as if he owned the entire school, walking with a casual swagger that stemmed from knowing the rules rarely applied to him. His perfectly styled blonde hair looked as if he had just stepped out of a magazine. He wore his uniform as if it were a costume, loosening his tie and leaving his shirt untucked to emphasize his disregard for the rules. "Hey," Ethan called out one morning as the twins crossed the courtyard toward their lockers. His voice was loud, self-assured, intended to draw attention. His group of friends gathered around him, already laughing as if they didn't even need to hear the joke to know it would be amusing. "Did you two get lost on your way to the service entrance?" he asked, his words clear and biting in the open air. His friends erupted in laughter, too loud for the weak insult. But they weren't laughing at the humor itself. They were laughing at the targets. Nicole kept her gaze forward, her face serene, her steps even. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Maya's eyes flicked to Ethan for a fleeting moment, sharp and steady, but she didn't break her stride either. She saw the smirk on his face, saw his friends nudging each other, feeding off the attention, and though her chest tightened with anger, she kept it carefully concealed. They both did, but Ethan wasn't finished. "Guess they don't understand English," he called out louder, ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "Maybe we should try speaking their language. What is it, jungle gibberish?" The ensuing laughter was even more offensive this time. It spread through the crowd, drawing in more students, even those who hadn't paid attention initially. Now they were watching, waiting, some amused, some curious, none of them caring enough to intervene. Maya's jaw clenched, her teeth grinding together, but she took a slow, deliberate breath, regaining her composure. She could feel Nicole close by, her presence a steady anchor preventing her from being swept away by the storm Ethan was trying to create. They continued to move. In the days that followed, the situation only deteriorated. Ethan's cronies, Jake and Brandon, intensified their harassment. They made a game of bumping into the twins in the hallways, knocking their books to the floor with insincere apologies and smug expressions that clearly indicated their intent. "Didn't realize they were letting the cleaning crew take classes now," Jake muttered one afternoon as he brushed past them. "Just loud enough for the nearby students to overhear." "Maybe they're just here for practice," Brandon added with a smirk. "School's got to keep the floors clean somehow." The twins remained silent. They picked up their scattered books, straightened their backs, and continued on their way. But with each shove, each insult, the pressure mounted incrementally, like a weight slowly bearing down on them, testing their resilience. What compounded the difficulty was the silence from everyone else. No teachers intervened. No students spoke out in their defense. Even those who didn't actively participate simply looked away, feigning ignorance. The teachers kept their attention fixed on their papers or computer screens, unwilling to get involved, unwilling to acknowledge that this seemingly perfect school harbored anything ugly beneath its polished facade. At home, their father noticed the subtle signs, even though they tried to conceal their distress. David Harrison had taught them how to fight, how to defend themselves with skill and precision. But he had also taught them to recognize impending trouble, to heed the quiet signals that foreshadowed larger conflicts. Over dinner, he observed his daughters closely, noting the tightness in their jaws and the weariness in their eyes. He didn't question them directly, respecting their space until they were ready to share. But when they finally confided in him, he listened without interruption. "You remember what I taught you," David said that night, his voice calm, yet lacking any softness. "Control is power. They want to get under your skin. Don't let them." Maya nodded, her mouth set in a firm line. Nicole mirrored her sister's resolve, though a hint of frustration flickered in her eyes, growing harder to conceal. "They're pushing," Maya stated. "Subtly, but persistently. Harder every day." "They will," David replied without hesitation. "They think you'll break. They want you to. And if they don't stop?" Nicole asked, her voice equally steady, her meaning clear. David's eyes met theirs, and in that look, there was no hesitation, no doubt. "Then they'll find out you're not the ones who break." His words hung in the air like a quiet promise, one the twins carried with them into the next day and the days that followed, letting it lie just beneath the surface of their composed expressions as they navigated the halls of Crestwood Academy with their heads held high, knowing it wasn't a matter of if things would escalate, but when. And that moment was rapidly approaching. The days blurred together, each one feeling colder and more unforgiving than the last, as if the very walls of Crestwood Academy were gradually closing in on Maya and Nicole, squeezing just enough to remind them that this place was never truly meant for them, and every passing hour felt like another test of their endurance. They had maintained their composure through the stares and the whispers, through the petty insults and the forced laughter of students who had long since learned that cruelty was rewarded, not punished. But beneath their calm exteriors, they could feel the pressure building, steadily and surely, like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. It was Ethan, predictably, who decided that words and minor shoves were no longer sufficient. He had always craved a larger audience, always wanted to see how far he could push before someone reached their breaking point. Sensing the emerging cracks in their resilience, he wasted no time in devising something cruel enough to capture the attention of the entire school, something that would humiliate the twins in a way they could never simply shrug off, regardless of their outward strength. The plan was uncomplicated, as cruelty often is, especially when fueled by arrogance and a crowd willing to participate. It began one morning when Maya and Nicole arrived to find their lockers defaced with ugly, hateful words scrawled across the metal in thick, dripping red paint. The slurs were blatant, shameless, left there for all to witness. Black markers had been used to draw grotesque, cartoonish faces with exaggerated features intended to mock them, the images twisted and dehumanizing. Crumpled papers had been stuffed through the locker vents, each one containing more insults, each more vile than the last, as if the bullies had competed to see who could write the most offensive thing. As they stood there, shoulders squared, faces tight with contained emotion, the hallway around them erupted in laughter, sharp and cruel, with students pausing to point, to capture the moment on their phones, to spread it like wildfire. Some laughed openly, loud and unrestrained, while others covered their mouths, feigning amusement. But it made no difference. The twins saw it all, felt every jab like a needle prick under their skin. Ethan leaned against a nearby locker, arms crossed, observing the scene unfold with a wide grin of victory on his face, his eyes gleaming. Jake and Brandon flanked him, both looking self-satisfied, their smugness evident in their posture. "Figured we'd give you some decorations," Ethan called out loudly enough for the entire hall to hear, his voice dripping with false concern. "Thought it might help you feel more at home." The crowd roared with laughter, the sound echoing through the hallway like a crashing wave, relentless and loud. And for a brief moment, even the teachers who happened to pass by hesitated, their eyes lingering for a fraction of a second before quickly looking away, pretending not to see, pretending it wasn't their responsibility. Nicole's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to maintain steady breathing. Her chest tight with anger she struggled to suppress. She could feel her sister beside her, could sense Maya's fury simmering just beneath the surface, held in check only by sheer willpower. They had endured the names, they had endured the shoves. But this was different, public, deliberate, a performance intended to strip away their dignity in front of the entire school. And despite their efforts to remain composed, the weight of it pressed down harder than anything they had faced before. Their father's steady, clear words echoed in their minds, urging them to maintain control, to let their discipline guide them. But as the laughter persisted and Ethan stepped forward with a slow, mocking clap, they both felt that fragile line growing thinner, the line between patience and action. "You should say thank you," Ethan sneered, now standing close, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Takes a lot of effort to make you two feel like you belong." The crowd hung on his words, their eyes darting between him and the twins, waiting, eager for any sign of weakness. Maya's eyes locked onto Ethan's, her stare unwavering and intense. And though she remained silent, the message in her gaze was unmistakable. Nicole, standing equally resolute, felt the same anger rising within her, her pulse quickening as she took a slow, steadying breath against the rising tide of fury. They would not give him the reaction he desired. Not yet. But neither of them could pretend this would simply pass. They both knew something had shifted in that moment, something sharp and irreversible. This wasn't just another insult to ignore. This wasn't something they could dismiss like the hallway whispers or the classroom's sneers. This was a line crossed, a challenge thrown at their feet in front of the entire school. As they later cleaned their lockers, wiping away the paint with rough paper towels handed to them by the janitor, who avoided their eyes and said nothing. Maya's voice broke the silence between them, low and certain, carrying a weight that had been accumulating for far too long. "No more," she said, her tone quiet but as firm as stone. Nicole didn't need to ask for clarification. She felt the same burning resolve within her, the same final crack running through the patience they had so diligently maintained. She nodded once, sharply and decisively. "No more," she agreed. The decision wasn't born solely from anger. It stemmed from a deeper understanding that mere survival wasn't always enough. That there were moments when remaining passive meant surrendering pieces of oneself that could never be reclaimed. The moment was approaching. They could sense it as clearly as the air they breathed. The next time Ethan and his crew confronted them, they would not walk away. They would fight, and they would fight as they had been taught from the very beginning. The atmosphere at Crestwood Academy hadn't softened since the cruel prank. If anything, it had grown heavier, like an unseen weight hanging in the air that everyone could feel. Tension stretched taut across the courtyard as students gathered in their usual spots, speaking in hushed tones, casting more frequent glances toward the paths they all knew the twins would take. Maya and Nicole, side by side as always, felt every watchful eye, every whisper that swirled in the air like smoke too thick to ignore. But they maintained their steady pace, their heads held high, their eyes forward, yet fully aware of what awaited them just around the next turn. Ethan Blackwood was already there, leaning against the sun-warmed stone wall with an expression that perfectly blended boredom and cruelty, as if this encounter was less about a decision and more about something he believed was already predetermined. Jake and Brandon stood on either side of him, their posture relaxed but their eyes sharp, waiting for their opportunity like wolves watching their prey come within reach. "There they are," Ethan announced loudly enough to capture the attention of every nearby student, the sound of his voice carrying across the courtyard like a flare shot into the sky, drawing a wider circle of onlookers who didn't even attempt to conceal their curiosity. "Thought you two might have taken the hint and stayed home today." Maya's gaze, sharp and unwavering, found him instantly. She didn't stop walking, didn't flinch at his words, but there was no mistaking the way her eyes held him in place, steady and cold. "If that's what you were hoping," she replied smoothly, her tone even and clear for everyone to hear, "then you're even more pathetic than I thought." A low murmur rippled through the students as they registered the sharp edge of her words. Ethan's smirk twitched at the corners, faltering for a moment to reveal a flash of annoyance beneath. "You've got a lot of nerve," Ethan snapped, pushing himself off the wall and taking a step closer, closing the distance between them with the casual arrogance of someone who had never expected to be challenged. "Talking like that, acting like you belong here." Nicole shifted her stance, squaring her shoulders, her voice steady but carrying the weight of every insult they had swallowed, every cruel prank they had endured in silence until now. "We do belong here," she stated firmly, her eyes locked on Ethan without a trace of hesitation. "More than you ever will. You walk around like you own this place, but deep down you know the truth. Without your little gang, you're just another coward hiding behind cheap jokes and weak friends." Her words struck deeper than she might have anticipated, cutting through the shallow facade Ethan wore like a mask. The crowd responded with a louder stir, students glancing at each other, sensing the shift in the moment, feeling the ground beneath this confrontation begin to tremble. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he closed the remaining gap between them, now standing so close that Maya could see the flicker of uncertainty behind his glare, though he quickly masked it with rage. "Say that again," he challenged, his voice tight and brittle, like glass about to shatter. "You heard her the first time," Maya replied calmly, her gaze never wavering. "You just don't like the truth when it's spoken to your face." Ethan's chest rose sharply as he fought to maintain his bravado, but the cracks were visible for anyone to see. He turned his glare toward the crowd, feeding off their attention, needing it to rebuild his confidence. "You think you're tough, You think you can stand there and run your mouths without paying for it? We don't think, Nicole interjected, her tone sharpening just enough to cut through the surrounding noise. We know. That was the final provocation Ethan needed to abandon words entirely. His hand shot out without warning, slamming hard into Maya's shoulder, forcing her to stumble backward despite her attempt to brace herself, her feet planting firmly against the ground as if rooted there. The crowd gasped loudly and sharply, students drawing in their breath as the scene before them transitioned from tense words to open threat. Jake, seizing the opportunity, moved toward Nicole, swatting her books from her arms with a cruel smirk, sending pages scattering across the pavement in a messy display that echoed the locker prank from days prior. Brandon followed suit, shoving hard into Nicole's shoulder, his voice dripping with mockery. What now? Gonna run to Daddy? That was the definitive line crossed, clear as day, bold and undeniable. Maya's eyes burned into Ethan's, her voice calm but packed with the fury that had been building beneath her ribs for far too long. No, she stated, her breath steady, her words loud enough for all to hear. We're done running? Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her movement fluid and controlled, and placed her palm against Ethan's chest with a sharp, practiced force that sent him stumbling backward, his eyes wide with surprise as the air rushed out of him. At her side, Nicole moved just as smoothly, dropping low and sweeping Brandon's legs from under him with precision, sending him sprawling across the ground with a heavy thud that instantly silenced his laughter. The courtyard erupted with noise, students shouting, stepping back to form a wide circle around the unfolding confrontation. Their faces were a mixture of shock and excitement as the twins took control of the moment. Ethan recovered quickly, but his usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by pure frustration as he lunged at Maya, swinging clumsily. But she saw it coming from a mile away, slipping under his swing and driving her fist into his stomach with tight, controlled power. Brandon tried to scramble to his feet, but Nicole was already there, grabbing his shoulder and twisting him back down to the pavement once more, her movements sharp and decisive. Every step of her response honed by years of training that flowed through her muscles like second nature. Jake lunged toward her, wild and desperate. But Nicole sidestepped cleanly, catching his arm as he charged past and flipping him down hard beside his friend, leaving both of them tangled and gasping for air. Ethan, clutching his midsection, staggered back toward Maya with a snarl, but she met him with a clean strike under his chin, snapping his head back and forcing him to stumble away, his balance failing as he tried to regain it. The twins didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't second-guess the choice they had made. Their father's lessons, ingrained through countless hours of practice, guided every move they made, every block, every counter, every strike. They weren't there to put on a show for the crowd. They weren't there to prove anything to the onlookers. They were there because a line had been crossed, and they were ready. The courtyard had become their arena, and as the fight intensified, it became clear to everyone watching that Maya and Nicole were not the victims in this narrative. They were the reckoning. The courtyard, which had begun the day with casual morning chatter and idle footsteps, now pulsed with an energy so sharp and alive that it felt as though every brick beneath their feet had begun to vibrate. The circle of students had widened, voices rising in a blend of shock and thrill as Maya and Nicole moved like a storm finally unleashed. Their bodies worked in perfect synchronization, every strike and counter landing with a precision born not of uncontrolled rage, but of years of rigorous, patient training. Ethan, forced backward by Maya's swift, punishing blows, tried to compose himself, but fear was now creeping into his eyes, clear and unmistakable beneath the flush of his skin and the sweat beading on his forehead. He had always considered himself untouchable, shielded by his numbers and his social standing. But none of that protected him now, here. Stripped of his usual smug advantage, he stood face to face with someone who would not cower and would not yield. "You thought we'd just take it," Maya said, her breath controlled, her voice steady even as she dodged another wild swing and responded with a sharp elbow to Ethan's ribs that made him grunt and stumble sideways. "You thought you could keep pushing until we broke?" Her words cut as deeply as her strikes. And Ethan, still gasping for air, found himself struggling not only against her fists but against the truth in her voice, loud enough for everyone watching to hear and feel it to their core. Brandon, having managed to get back on his feet, charged at Nicole with a frustrated snarl, but she met him head-on, slipping under his swing and driving her palm into his sternum with enough force to send him crashing backward, his body folding over as he hit the ground hard, struggling for breath that wouldn't come. "You picked the wrong fight," Nicole added, her tone as sharp as steel as she watched Brandon writhe on the ground before her, her eyes never leaving him as she took a single measured step closer, making it clear she wouldn't give him an easy chance to rise again. Jake, desperate to change the course of the fight, grabbed a broken piece of wood from the ground, something that had fallen from one of the benches, gripping it with both hands as he rushed toward Nicole with reckless force. But she saw him coming as if in slow motion, her senses heightened by adrenaline and discipline, her body already moving to intercept. She sidestepped his charge with smooth precision, her hand snapping out to catch his wrist in a firm, unbreakable grip, twisting sharply to disarm him and send the makeshift weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. In the same fluid motion, she spun, driving her elbow into the side of his face and sending him crashing to his knees, dazed and defeated. "Cheap shots won't save you now," she said, her words low but clear, carrying across the circle of watching students who had fallen into a breathless silence, their earlier amusement replaced by something closer to awe and fear. Ethan, furious and embarrassed, lunged at Maya once more, his fists swinging wildly and sloppily, driven by panic rather than skill. But Maya was already a step ahead, weaving under his attack and catching his wrist in a tight grip, twisting it sharply as she stepped into him and drove her knee into his stomach with brutal force. His breath exploded from his lungs in a choked sound as he collapsed to the ground, clutching his ribs. "You've had every chance to walk away," Maya said firmly, not just to Ethan but to every single person watching, her voice carrying the weight of everything she and her sister had endured up to this point. "But you kept coming." She released his wrist, letting him fall completely to the pavement, his body folding in on itself as he struggled to breathe, his face contorted with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Nicole stood beside her sister now, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The two of them side by side once more, just as they had been when they first entered this school. Only now the ground beneath their feet felt different, as if they had claimed it for themselves through sheer force of will. The crowd around them, once eager for a spectacle, now stood in uneasy silence, the realization settling heavily that this was no ordinary fight, no simple exchange of blows between schoolyard rivals. This was something deeper, something final, a storm that had been brewing for far too long and had finally broken free. "Maybe now you'll learn," Nicole said, her voice cutting through the thick, charged air, "that we're not the ones you can push around." As if driven by sheer stubborn pride, Brandon tried once more to rise. But Nicole was there before he could fully lift himself, planting her foot firmly on his chest and pressing him back down to the ground with undeniable authority. He grunted in frustration, trapped beneath the weight of his own arrogance and her unwavering strength. "Stay down," she warned him, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, as unshakable as the ground beneath them. Maya's eyes swept the courtyard, meeting the gaze of every student brave enough to hold it, her expression steady and unyielding. She didn't need to speak the words aloud, because they were clearly written across her face. This ends here, and it ends now. But even as the twins stood victorious over the bullies who had tormented them for weeks, they knew this wasn't the true end of the conflict. They could sense it in the way the crowd shifted uncomfortably, in the absence of any teachers arriving, in the whispers that were already beginning to circulate, filled with distorted accounts of what had just transpired. They knew there would be consequences, that victory came with its own price. But they didn't regret their actions, not for a single moment. Because for the first time since setting foot on this campus, they had made it unequivocally clear to everyone watching that they were not to be underestimated, not to be toyed with, not to be humiliated without facing the repercussions. The twins stood tall, their breath steady, their eyes unwavering as they watched the defeated boys writhe on the ground. The physical fight might have concluded for now, but the larger storm had only just begun. The aftermath of the brawl didn't descend into chaos, as one might have anticipated, but rather into a strange, drawn-out silence that seemed to stretch the very fabric of each moment, amplifying the weight of what had just occurred until it felt heavy enough to press down on every witness. Even as the bullies lay groaning on the pavement, clutching bruised ribs and nursing their wounded pride, the crowd that had once cheered for their cruelty now stood frozen, their earlier thirst for spectacle replaced by a cautious, almost guilty quiet. No teacher had appeared during the fight. Not a single adult had intervened to stop what had unfolded in plain sight. But now, as if summoned by the palpable tension left behind, they began to trickle onto the scene, their expressions tight with confusion and concern, though none could feign genuine surprise. Deep down, they had all seen this coming, or at least they had sensed the inevitability of something breaking beneath the polished surface of the school's walls, and now that it had, they could no longer pretend ignorance. "Enough!" came the sharp voice of Mr. Abernathy, the assistant principal, as he pushed through the circle of students, his eyes scanning the scene with a look that hovered between outrage and relief that he had arrived only after the violence had ceased. His gaze swept from the injured boys sprawled across the courtyard to the twins standing tall at the center of it all, their breathing controlled, their postures strong, their faces set with an unflinching calm that made it impossible to portray them as anything but the victors. "What is going on here?" Abernathy demanded, though the question hung in the air more as a formality than a genuine inquiry, because the scene before him clearly illustrated what had transpired. Before Maya or Nicole could respond, Ethan coughed painfully and forced himself to speak through gritted teeth. They attacked us," he gasped, his voice thick with desperation and fear, but also with the familiar entitlement of someone who believed he could still control the narrative if he spoke first. "At first, we didn't do anything. They just went crazy." The crowd shifted uneasily, their silence beginning to crack under the weight of the lie. Some students looked away, unwilling to meet the eyes of the twins or the adults now gathering, while others stared at Ethan with uncertainty, unsure whether to follow his lead or finally acknowledge what they had witnessed firsthand. Maya's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure, her father's steadying words echoing in her mind. "Unwavering control is power. Speak only when it truly matters." She met Abernathy's gaze directly, her eyes clear and sharp, and stated in a firm, even tone, "They've been targeting us since we arrived. Today, they pushed it too far. We defended ourselves, nothing more." Abernathy's expression flickered, a brief moment of discomfort crossing his features before he masked it behind the rigid professionalism that Crestwood Academy demanded of its staff. "We'll sort this out inside," he said, though his words lacked any real promise of fairness. "All of you, come with me." The twins exchanged a quiet, understanding look and followed Abernathy, leaving behind a crowd whose excitement had turned to unease. Inside the administrative offices, the atmosphere felt more confined, the air cooler, but it did nothing to diminish the simmering resolve within the twins. They sat side by side in the stiff chairs outside the principal's office, their hands resting calmly on their knees, their gazes fixed straight ahead as Ethan, Jake, and Brandon exaggerated their injuries to anyone who would listen, casting themselves as victims in a wildly distorted narrative. Soon enough, their father arrived, his steps measured, his face composed, though beneath his calm exterior lay a fierce determination mirroring his daughter's. David Harrison entered the office with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced far greater challenges and had prepared for every eventuality. His eyes first sought out his daughters, checking not just for physical harm but for their inner strength. And when their unwavering gazes met his, a flicker of pride passed between them. He then turned to the principal, a man named Harrington, whose suit was as impeccably pressed as his expression was stern, as if he had been pulled away from something far more significant than the well-being of his students. "We will be conducting a full investigation," Harrington stated, his tone clipped, his hands folded neatly on the polished desk. "But in the meantime, I'm afraid both of your daughters will be suspended until we can review the facts." David's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but carried the weight of conviction. "My daughters were defending themselves. That much is clear, though I expected as much from this institution." Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly at the quiet accusation in David's words, but he offered no denial, only a thin, tight-lipped nod. Ethan's parents arrived shortly thereafter, and the tension in the room immediately intensified. Sandra Blackwood swept into the office with an air of entitlement, her sharp heels clicking on the floor, her eyes blazing with fury barely concealed behind a veneer of practiced concern. Her husband, Robert, followed closely, his broad frame stiff with anger, his jaw clenched as he shot a hostile glare toward David and the twins. "This is unacceptable," Sandra snapped before anyone could speak. "Our son has been assaulted. And you're telling me these violent girls are simply being suspended? They should be expelled, arrested." Her voice rose with each word, and though Harrington attempted to placate her with vague promises of further action, it was clear Sandra Blackwood would not be satisfied until the twins faced severe punishment. David's gaze remained fixed on her, his eyes steady and unreadable. But his daughters could sense the controlled tension within him, the same disciplined force he had taught them to cultivate. He watched her rage burn like dry tinder, fueled by lies and arrogance, allowing her to vent her fury until her words began to thin. "This isn't over," Sandra hissed finally, her eyes narrowing to sharp points as she turned her full glare on David, as if daring him to respond. "No," David replied evenly, his voice low and calm. "It's not." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, not as a rash threat, but as a promise born of certainty. As the twins rose from their chairs, their suspension papers handed to them with cold efficiency, they held their heads high, their posture unbroken, their eyes clear. The fight in the courtyard had ended, but a new battle had begun, one that would not be resolved with fists alone. And as they stepped out of the office, their father walking between them, they understood with perfect clarity that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The house stood in quiet repose beneath the late afternoon sky, the distant hum of traffic and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze creating an almost unnerving stillness, as if the conflict that had erupted at Crestwood Academy had followed them home, but lingered just beyond the horizon, waiting for the opportune moment to resurface. Inside, the atmosphere was heavier than usual, not with fear or regret, but with the shared understanding that the events at school were not the end of their troubles. They had anticipated the fallout. They knew the Blackwoods wouldn't let it rest. David sat at the kitchen table, his posture relaxed yet alert, his eyes fixed on the open window overlooking the quiet street. It was as if he could foresee what was coming long before it arrived. His daughters sat across from him, the three of them gathered not in silence, but in a state of shared readiness, their bond stronger than blood, fortified by everything they had endured and everything they had fought for that day. "You knew they'd come here," Maya said, her voice steady, not as a question but as a statement of fact they all understood implicitly. Her father gave a single, subtle nod, his gaze still fixed on the street, his mind already anticipating the steps ahead. "People like them," David replied, his tone calm and even, "don't accept losses quietly. They convince themselves they're entitled to win, regardless of the truth. And when they face defeat, They bring the fight to your doorstep, expecting to find you unprepared. Nicole's gaze flickered toward the window, her hands resting flat on the table, her fingers loose but ready, her mind dissecting her father's words with the same precision she had applied to every move in the courtyard. "They think we're finished because we walked away," she said, her tone low but sharp. "But they've never understood what true strength looks like." Before David could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel carried through the air, clear and sharp as a warning. They heard car doors slam shut, heavy and angry, followed by the unmistakable sound of expensive shoes stomping on the pavement. A rhythm of entitlement and rage drawing closer to their front door with each step. "They're here," Maya said quietly. Though the words were unnecessary, the situation was now undeniable. David rose from his chair in one fluid motion, his presence filling the room not with tension, but with a solid, grounded certainty. "Stay behind me," he instructed his daughters, not out of fear for what was coming, but because he wanted them to witness how a battle was engaged when it crossed the threshold of their home. He wanted them to understand that strength wasn't always measured in fists alone, but in the unwavering stance one took when the world tried to push back. Before the doorbell could ring, before a knock could sound, David opened the door himself, stepping out onto the porch with the quiet authority of a man who had weathered storms far greater than the one now standing before him. Sandra Blackwood's face was contorted in a mask of fury, barely held together by a thin veneer of social decorum, her eyes burning beneath perfectly styled hair and expensive sunglasses perched on her head like a crown of false superiority. Robert Blackwood stood beside her, his broad frame rigid with barely suppressed anger, his jaw tight as his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out like taut cords. "You think you can get away with this?" Sandra spat, dispensing with any semblance of greeting, her words sharp and rapid as she stepped closer to David, her heels clicking hard on the concrete. "You think you can lay your hands on our son and there won't be consequences?" David's expression remained unchanged, his gaze steady and unwavering as he met her fury with the calm of a mountain against the wind. "Your son attacked my daughters," he replied, his voice low but carrying enough force to fill the space between them completely. "They defended themselves. That's the truth, whether you choose to accept it or not. Don't you dare play the victim here." Robert snarled, his voice rough, almost trembling with rage as he took a half step forward, his posture aggressive, his fists still clenching and unclenching as if itching for an excuse to strike. "Your girls are animals, just like you, and you've got the nerve to act like you're innocent." The words hung in the air like a foul stench, drawing a cold stillness over the moment. But David did not rise to the bait. He let the insult linger between them, allowing it to reveal more about the man before him than any argument could have. And then he responded, not with fury, but with absolute clarity. "You've already made up your mind about who we are," David said, his tone as smooth as stone. "But that doesn't change the facts. You raised a bully, and today he found out what happens when bullies cross the wrong line." Sandra's face contorted further in anger, her mouth opening to unleash another insult. But before she could speak, her husband stepped past her, consumed by his own rage beyond the point of restraint. "You think you can talk down to us in our own town?" Robert growled, his voice escalating as he swung a wild, heavy fist at David. His face flushed with fury, his eyes wide with the blind certainty that force would prevail where words had failed. But David was already in motion, turning his body with practiced ease, his hand rising to intercept Robert's wrist mid-swing. The force of the blow was completely arrested by the strength in David's steady grip. Robert's eyes widened in surprise as David twisted his arm just enough to disrupt his balance, guiding him to stumble sideways before releasing him without expending unnecessary energy. "You've made your choice," David said evenly, his eyes hard as iron. "Now you'll live with the consequences." But Robert, too enraged and too foolish to heed reason, charged again, this time with both hands raised in a clumsy attempt to wrestle David down, as if brute strength could overcome years of discipline and skill. Sandra, shrieking something unintelligible, tried to follow, her hands clawing at David's arm, her fury a chaotic storm of uncontrolled rage. David moved with clean precision, stepping back just enough to draw both of them forward, using their own momentum against them. He caught Robert's arm again, disrupted his balance further, and sent him sprawling onto the porch floor with a thud that resonated through the wooden planks. Sandra swung at him wildly, but David intercepted her wrist just as smoothly, twisting her arm behind her back with careful, practiced control that left her momentarily trapped, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. "You came to my home," David said quietly, his voice carrying not just power, but finality. "You thought you'd bring fear into this house, but fear doesn't reside here." And with those words, the truth of the situation settled over the porch completely, undeniable and absolute. For a fleeting moment, a frozen stillness hung in the air, the kind of moment so taut it felt as though the slightest touch could shatter it. The Blackwoods were caught between fury and fear. David held Sandra firmly in place, while Robert awkwardly struggled to push himself up from the wooden boards beneath him, his pride more bruised than his body, but his eyes still blazing with a blind rage that prevented him from seeing the futility of his actions. His face was flushed a deep red, veins throbbing at his temples, his jaw tight as he fought to swallow his humiliation and transmute it back into aggression, though anyone observing could see his bravado was rapidly eroding under the weight of reality. "You let me go!" Sandra hissed, twisting against David's unwavering grip, her voice sharp with panic, thinly veiled as anger. But the tremor beneath the surface betrayed her forced composure. "Do you know who we are?" David's eyes, steady and cold, did not flicker as he maintained his hold on her wrist, firm enough to convey control, but not enough to inflict unnecessary pain. "I know exactly who you are," he responded, his voice even and low, his gaze as sharp as a blade honed by years of quiet battles, "and it doesn't impress me." Robert, now back on his feet, charged again without thinking, his movements clumsy with anger, his body lunging forward in a way that revealed a history of relying on brute force rather than actual fighting skill, assuming no one would dare to retaliate. But David had encountered this type of man countless times before. He sidestepped Robert's charge with ease, pivoting smoothly and using his opponent's momentum to propel him directly into the porch railing, the wood groaning under the impact. "You think this is over?" Robert barked, even as he staggered backward, gasping for breath, spitting his words through gritted teeth as if they might carry weight now that his fists had failed him. "You're finished. You and your girls, all of you." David's reply was calm, devoid of any fury because none was needed. Only the clear, undeniable truth. "No," he said, stepping toward Robert with the quiet power of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. "You are." Robert threw another punch, wild and desperate, but David intercepted his arm once more, locking it in a tight grasp before twisting him around and slamming him down onto the porch floor, flat on his back. The air was knocked from Robert's lungs in a harsh gasp that left him sputtering beneath David's shadow. Sandra screamed, her panic now undisguised as she frantically tried to break free, clawing at David's arm with trembling hands. But her movements were erratic, fueled by the raw fear that had finally surfaced now that she saw her husband defeated. David released her wrist, not because she had forced him to, but because he no longer needed to restrain her. Her strength had evaporated, leaving her stumbling backward, her chest heaving with frantic breaths. The twins stood just inside the doorway, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them, their faces etched with quiet focus, not fear. They watched their father handle the Blackwoods not with uncontrolled aggression, but with deliberate precision, every movement a lesson they had witnessed in practice, now fully realized, a living testament to the discipline he had instilled in them throughout their lives. "This is what they always do," David said, his voice loud enough for both the Blackwoods and his daughters to hear, his words steady and strong as he stepped over Robert's groaning form. "They think they can invade our space, our lives, and break us with threats and violence, but they forget. We don't yield. We stand." Sandra's eyes darted toward her husband, who lay struggling to breathe, and then back to David, her lips parting as if to utter another threat or excuse, but no words came. Her breath hitched in her chest, her rage swallowed whole by the weight of her own helplessness. "Call the police!" she shrieked at last, her voice cracking under the strain of her panic. "Call them! He attacked us!" But even as she screamed the words, they rang hollow, a shaky weakness revealing her own disbelief in her cries. "You came here," David reminded her, never raising his voice, but allowing each word to settle like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading until escape was impossible. "You brought violence to my door, and now you will live with what you brought." Robert, still gasping on the porch floor, managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his eyes wild with disbelief as he stared up at David, seeing not just the man before him, but everything he had underestimated, everything he had failed to comprehend until this moment had stripped him of his false power. Sirens, faint at first but rapidly growing louder, began to echo through the neighborhood, the approaching sound slicing through the heavy air like a blade. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mixture of curiosity and quiet satisfaction, as if they too had grown weary of the Blackwood's arrogance, and now watched with silent approval as justice unfolded on the Harrisons' front porch. David remained still, unfazed by the approaching sirens. He stood tall, unshaken, his daughters beside him, their eyes clear and proud as they watched the scene play out. Whatever the police would bring next, they were prepared, because they had already won the battle that truly mattered. This confrontation was never solely about the physical blows exchanged or the bruises left behind. It was about standing firm when others expected them to fall, about demonstrating to the Blackwoods, the school, and the entire community that their strength was not something that could be taken or broken, no matter the intensity of the pressure. As the flashing lights rounded the corner and the first patrol car pulled into the driveway, David's voice broke the heavy silence one final time, carrying across the porch, across the yard, and into the memory of every witness. "You came looking for a fight," he stated, his tone unwavering, his presence as solid as the ground beneath him. "Now you've found it." The flashing blue and red lights washed over the front of the house, pulsing against the walls and windows in slow, steady waves, as though the storm that had raged at their doorstep was not ending, but merely transforming, trading fists and fury for the cold authority of uniforms and badges. David remained the still point at the center of it all, his daughters flanking him on either side, the three of them framed by the doorway like an unbroken line of defense against the chaos that had so vehemently tried to breach their home. The first officers emerged from their vehicles with practiced caution, their hands near their belts, their eyes sweeping over the scene, silently assessing the details. The two disheveled and breathless figures on the porch floor, the composed and unwavering man standing before them. The neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns, watching with tight expressions, some crossing their arms, others whispering amongst themselves beneath the fading echo of the sirens. Sandra Blackwood's voice sliced through the tension first, sharp and frantic, her volume increasing as she rushed toward the officers, her arms waving as if she could sway them to her side through sheer desperation. "Officer, officer, arrest him!" she demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at David, her face flushed with anger and a deeper, rawer fear poorly concealed beneath her rage. "He attacked us. We were defending ourselves, and he assaulted us in our own community." Her words tumbled over each other in a rush, her breath growing shorter with each accusation. But the lead officer, a man whose badge read Kessler, did not react with immediate acceptance. He raised a steady hand, his eyes scanning not just Sandra, but the entire scene, reading it with the quiet experience of someone who had witnessed enough of life's complexities to know that the truth rarely lay on the surface. "Ma'am," Officer Kessler said, his tone measured and professional, "I need you to step back and take a breath. We're going to sort this out, but I need to hear from everyone, and I'll start by speaking to the homeowner." Sandra opened her mouth to protest, but something in Kessler's steady gaze stopped her short. She let out a sharp breath, her chest heaving as she stepped back beside Robert, who still lay groaning on the porch floor, clutching his ribs as if the physical pain could somehow lend more credibility to his words when his turn to speak arrived. Officer Kessler approached David next, his eyes cautious but not hostile, his tone neutral. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" David met the officer's gaze directly, his posture steady, his voice calm and even as he spoke. "They came to my home uninvited," he explained, not rushing his words, allowing each one to carry weight and clarity. "They were angry about an incident at the school involving our children. They confronted me on my porch. They shouted threats, and then David gestured with a slight nod toward Robert. "Through the first punch, I defended myself and my family." "And your daughters?" Kessler asked, his eyes flicking toward Maya and Nicole, who stood silent but strong beside their father. "They witnessed everything," David replied without hesitation, his tone firm. "They did not engage. They stayed inside, just as I instructed them to." Kessler gave a small nod, his gaze thoughtful, weighing David's account against the scene before him. He turned next to Sandra and Robert, his notepad in hand, ready to hear their side, though the quiet skepticism in his expression was already evident. Sandra launched into her version of events with the same breathless desperation she had displayed earlier, weaving lies with practiced ease, portraying herself and her husband as victims of an unprovoked assault, their words dripping with entitlement as they cast David in the role of the aggressor. But her performance faltered under the steady gaze of Officer Kessler, who made no attempt to interrupt, yet whose eyes darkened with quiet doubt the longer she spoke. "And you claim you were defending yourselves?" Kessler asked once she had finished, his tone carefully neutral but tinged with disbelief. "We came here to talk," Sandra insisted, her voice rising again, but the cracks in her composure were now apparent as she struggled to maintain her narrative. "He attacked us." Kessler's eyes narrowed slightly, and then, as if sensing that words alone were insufficient to uncover the truth, he turned to the growing group of neighbors standing at the edges of their yards, some holding their phones, others speaking quietly among themselves. "I'm going to need witness statements," Kessler called out, his voice carrying across the lawn with quiet authority. "Anyone who saw what happened, please step forward." A long moment of silence hung in the air, heavy and uncertain, and then slowly, as if spurred by a shared sense of justice that had been waiting for its moment, a neighbor stepped forward from across the street, an older man with a weathered face and keen eyes that missed nothing. He cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw the whole thing," he stated, his voice firm. "They came here shouting from the moment they got out of their car. The man threw the first punch. The homeowner didn't move until they forced his hand." Another neighbor followed, then another, their voices intertwining to create a clearer picture, a chorus of truth that cut through Sandra's lies like sunlight through fog. Each account corroborated David's statement, their words consistent, their memories sharp. Kessler listened intently to every word, his pen moving steadily across his notepad, and when the last neighbor had finished speaking, Kessler closed his notepad with a quiet snap that seemed to echo louder than the sirens had moments before. "We're going to continue this at the station," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But based on what I've heard so far, it looks like we have more questions for you two." His gaze settled on Sandra and Robert, their faces pale and drawn beneath the harsh glare of the police lights. Officers moved in to help Robert to his feet, cuffing him gently but firmly as Sandra's protests rose again, thinner now, weaker, her voice trailing off into helplessness as the weight of reality pressed down hard and final. David stood unmoving as they were led away, his daughters at his side, his breath slow and steady, his gaze fixed not on the Blackwoods, but on the horizon beyond them, where justice at long last was beginning to find its place. And though the night was far from over, though questions would still need answers and shadows would still need to be cleared away, there was no mistaking the shift that had begun. The tide was turning, and this time, it was turning in their favor. The station possessed the cold stillness of a place that had witnessed too many lives confined within its walls, too many voices raised in panic or denial, too many truths twisted under the weight of assumptions. Yet, as David and his daughters sat in the plain metal chairs of the waiting area, there was no fear in them, no tremor in their hands or their breathing, only the quiet, measured patience of a family that had weathered far greater storms and understood that the only path forward was to stand firm and allow the truth to surface, slowly and inexorably, like the tide against the rocks. Officer Kessler moved between desks and filing cabinets with the focused demeanor of a man who could discern the shape of a lie the moment it reached his ears, who had seen too many scenes like the current one to mistake noise for genuine truth. He worked methodically, collecting statements, reviewing the accounts of the neighbors who had already begun filling out written testimonies, and checking the footage from nearby doorbell cameras that had been readily offered by residents eager to see justice finally served. David observed him silently, his eyes following Kessler's every action, not with suspicion, but with a cautious respect for the officer's diligence. He perceived not the hasty judgment of someone eager to close a case, but the slow, unwavering patience of an individual who understood that real answers emerged not from the loudest voices, but from those who maintained their ground on solid truth. Maya and Nicole sat close to their father, their posture erect, their expressions calm. Though inwardly, both felt the gradual churning of everything they had endured, everything they had carried, rising to the surface as the station's walls seemed to press in and the long wait stretched onward. Yet, even amidst the quiet tension, they did not waver. They had faced worse trials and emerged unbroken, and they knew they would navigate this one in the same manner. Kessler approached at last, his notepad tucked under one arm, his expression thoughtful, etched with the weight of the information he had gathered. He paused before them, clearing his throat gently before speaking. "Mr. Harrison," he began, his voice careful but firm, "I've reviewed the neighbor statements and the security footage, and it's clear you did not initiate the confrontation. It's also clear your actions were defensive." David offered a small nod, acknowledging the officer's words without triumph, without relief, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who expected nothing less from the truth. Kessler continued, shifting his weight slightly as he glanced at his notes. "Furthermore, the footage we've collected also shows that the Blackwoods came to your property aggressively. They crossed onto your porch first, they raised their voices, and they initiated physical contact. Multiple angles confirm this." A soft exhalation passed between Maya and Nicole. Not quite a sigh, but a slow release of held tension, a moment of quiet reassurance settling in their chests, like a small flame that had stubbornly refused to be extinguished by harsh winds. "However," Kessler went on, his tone still even, "given the severity of the injuries and the Blackwoods claims, we'll need to document everything fully. There will be formal statements, a full report, and there may still be legal proceedings. But I want you to know," he added, his gaze settling on David with something that bordered on respect, "from what I've seen, the evidence is clearly in your favor." David's reply was immediate. His voice, low and sure, stated, "You will have every answer you need." As they followed Kessler into the interview room, Maya and Nicole felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into their bones, not as a burden, but as a reminder of all they had endured to reach this point. They sat beside their father, answering questions with clarity, recounting the day's events in steady voices that conveyed the complete truth of their experience, leaving no room for doubt or distortion. Piece by piece, the story unfolded under the watchful eyes of the officers, not as a fabricated tale born of fear and prejudice, but as a clean, unbroken chain of facts that stretched from the initial shove in the courtyard to the final confrontation on their doorstep. They recounted the days of harassment, the cruel prank that had pushed them to their limit, the fight forced upon them by boys who believed they could act with impunity. They spoke not as victims, but as survivors, and as their narrative filled the room, the shape of the truth became undeniable. Later, as they stepped out of the interview room into a quieter area of the station, David turned to his daughters, his voice soft but carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "You see how it works," he said, not as a lesson, but as a reinforcement of what they already knew deep down. They will try to twist the story, to make it their own, but the truth is patient. It waits, and when the time comes, it stands tall. Maya met his gaze, her eyes bright with resolve. "We're not finished yet," she said, her voice firm. Nicole nodded beside her, her expression equally resolute. "But we're getting there." Kessler approached again, a slight tightness in his jaw as he flipped open his notepad once more. "There's something else," he said, his tone cautious but not hesitant. "One of your neighbors mentioned something about earlier trouble at the school. We're going to pull surveillance footage from the school property as well. If there's a pattern, it will help clear this up faster." At those words, a quiet understanding passed between David and his daughters. They had borne the weight of the bullying in isolation until now, enduring in silence while the school remained willfully blind. But if the truth of those days could finally be brought to light, then this battle would not only exonerate them, it would also expose the festering issues beneath the surface of Crestwood Academy for far too long. "Do it," David said without pause. "Let the whole story come out." Kessler gave a small nod and stepped away to make the call, his movements efficient, his purpose clear. As the quiet of the station settled around them once more, the twins and their father sat together, steady and unshaken, knowing the storm had not completely passed, but also knowing the tide had irrevocably turned in their favor, and whatever came next, they would be ready. The low, steady hum of the fluorescent lights filled the station, a sound that might have been insignificant at any other time, but here, under the weight of unfolding events, it seemed to underscore every passing second, stretching time as the final pieces of the truth began to fall into place. David sat with his daughters close beside him, the three of them, a solid line of resolve in a room that had grown thick with tension, the atmosphere heavy with the scent of paper, ink, and the slow burn of justice that was finally beginning to ignite. Across the room, through the narrow glass panels of the adjoining office, they could see Sandra and Robert Blackwood seated at a separate table, their composure unraveling under the mounting pressure. Sandra's sharp features, once held together by the confidence of entitlement, had begun to crack, her eyes darting from one officer to another, her mouth pressed into a thin line as if trying to suppress the fear that trembled just beneath her surface. Robert sat heavily in his chair, his shoulders slumped in a way that conveyed more than just physical discomfort, his gaze fixed away from the window, away from David's eyes, away from the inevitable. Officer Kessler returned to the room, a folder thick with printed photographs and reports tucked under his arm, his expression sharpened by the clarity that only undeniable evidence could provide. He moved with a sense of purpose that filled the space between them, pulling a chair closer to the table before setting the folder down and flipping it open, the first page catching the harsh overhead light. It was a still image captured from a neighbor's security camera, showing Robert Blackwood mid-swing, his face contorted in anger, his fist aimed directly at David's head. Without uttering a word, Kessler spread the images across the table, each one more damning than the last, capturing the escalation frame by frame. The truth lay bare in a sequence of moments too clear to dispute. There was no ambiguity in the photographs, no room left for twisting narratives or fabricating excuses, only the plain, irrefutable fact that the Blackwoods had brought their fury to David's doorstep and initiated the physical confrontation with their own actions. David's gaze remained steady on the images, his face composed, his breathing slow and even, not because the evidence surprised him, but because it validated what he had known from the outset, that the truth, though delayed, had never strayed from their side. We've also retrieved initial footage from the school's surveillance system, Kessler continued, his voice firm as he presented a second set of images. These were darker and grainier, but their narrative was no less clear. The camera had captured the vandalism at the lockers, the boys cornering your daughters in the hallway, the shove that precipitated the fight in the courtyard. Combined with this, the witness statements from your neighbors, and the admissions made by a few students after our follow-up, we have a compelling case building in your favor. At his words, a quiet breath passed between Maya and Nicole. Not a sigh of relief that indicated weakness, but a slow, patient exhale, as if they were allowing themselves, just for a moment, to feel the weight of the battle begin to lift from their shoulders. "And the Blackwoods?" David inquired, his voice low but steady, conveying not desperation, but the weight of responsibility, like a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Kessler's mouth tightened for a fleeting moment before he responded, his words chosen carefully but leaving no room for misinterpretation. "They're in deep," he replied, his tone edged with quiet finality. "They arrived here full of bluster, believing their version of events would carry weight on its own. But with this evidence, their accusations are rapidly falling apart. The more they speak, the deeper they entangle themselves." As Kessler spoke, movement beyond the glass caught David's attention. Another officer entered the room where Sandra and Robert sat, carrying a thick stack of papers, setting them down on the table with a thud that seemed to resonate through the very air between them. Sandra's mouth moved, her words inaudible through the glass, but her escalating panic was evident in her sharp, frantic gestures as she attempted to argue against the growing mountain of facts. Robert, despite his earlier rage, now sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the table before him, his hands clasped tightly together, as if he could somehow contain the consequences through sheer willpower. "Let them see it all," David said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, though Kessler heard him clearly and offered a small nod of agreement. "Let them see what happens when they push too far." "We intend to," Kessler replied, closing the folder with a deliberate motion, as if sealing the Blackwoods' fate within its pages. Moments later, another officer joined them, younger, his uniform crisp, but his expression already hardened by the realities of the job. He carried a printed transcript in his hands, placing it before Kessler with a subtle nod. "Statements from 2 of the students," the officer explained, his voice steady. "They corroborate the prior harassment at the school, consistent with what Mr. Harrison and his daughters have reported." Kessler scanned the pages quickly, his eyes sharpening with each line he read. "That should suffice," he said at last, placing the papers down with a quiet weight that seemed to settle not just on the table, but in the air around them. "We will be proceeding with charges, assault, trespassing, and potentially harassment, once the full extent of the situation at the school is established." David offered no outward reaction, his composure undisturbed. But Maya and Nicole felt the subtle shift in their father's posture, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had stood his ground, not merely for victory, but for justice itself. Sandra's voice, sharp even through the glass, rose once more. A desperate sound, devoid of its earlier confidence. Robert's shoulders slumped further, his head lowering as if he could no longer bear the weight of the truth pressing down on him from every direction. Officer Kessler turned back to David and his daughters, his expression softening slightly, almost respectful. "You've handled yourselves admirably," he said simply. "This will not be easy, and it is not over yet. But you did the right thing." David inclined his head once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than gratitude, for he had never sought approval, only what was just. As the officers moved to process the Blackwoods, leading them from the interview room with firm, unwavering steps, the Harrison family remained seated, their eyes steady, their hearts united in quiet resolve. The tide had not just turned, it had begun to sweep away the lies, revealing the truth beneath. And though the legal battle had yet to reach its final conclusion, they could see the end on the horizon, as certain and steady as the rising sun. And when that moment arrived, they would face it together. The station seemed to hold its breath under the weight of the revelations, as if the very walls, the air itself, had grown heavy with the truth finally brought into the open, too real and too solid to be denied or reshaped by those who had once believed themselves untouchable. David, seated between his daughters, remained still, his gaze steady as he watched the officers carry out their work. Their movements were no longer hurried or uncertain, but deliberate, guided by the clarity of evidence that had built, brick by brick, into an impenetrable wall around the Blackwoods' crumbling defense. Across the room, through the narrow strip of glass separating the main area from the smaller holding cell, Sandra paced like a caged animal, her hands twisting into tight fists at her sides, her eyes wild as they searched for something. Some weakness in the case, some loose thread to unravel the tightening net around her. But there was nothing left for her to grasp. No more lies to spin that hadn't already become too tangled to escape. Robert, once loud and self-assured, now sat slumped in his chair, his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his head bowed low beneath the burden of failure. His dull, lost eyes stared at the floor, as if the answers he sought might materialize there, if only he stared hard enough, but he found nothing except the hollow echo of his own choices staring back. Officer Kessler stood at the center of it all, his posture firm, his expression sharpened by the finality of the moment. He flipped through the last of the statements and recordings gathered in the hours since the Blackwoods had been brought in, his mind processing the complete narrative now laid bare before him. Neighbors' testimonies clear and consistent, camera footage from multiple angles painting an undeniable picture, and student witnesses at the school filling in any remaining gaps. He turned to David, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured to reach this point. "We have completed our preliminary findings, Mr. Harrison," Kessler began, his tone steady and without hesitation. "The charges against you and your daughters will be dropped immediately. The evidence leaves no room for any other conclusion." Maya and Nicole exchanged a look, a silent moment of understanding passing between them. Not of surprise, for they had always known their truth would prevail, but of quiet vindication, the kind that doesn't boast in triumph but settles deep within, steady and certain. David inclined his head slightly, his composure unwavering, though beneath his calm exterior there was the faintest release of the tension he had carried for his daughters, for his family. Every moment of this ordeal weighing on him more heavily than he would ever reveal. "And the Blackwoods?" David asked, not because he needed the answer, but because it was important for the words to be spoken plainly for all to hear. Kessler's gaze hardened as he responded. "They will face charges," he confirmed, enumerating each count with quiet precision, as if placing stones on a scale. "Assault, harassment, trespassing, and obstruction. Their actions at the school and here at your home are well documented. They will not be able to talk their way out of this." As if to emphasize his statement, another officer entered the holding area, unlocking the door with a sharp click of the key and gesturing for Sandra and Robert to stand. Sandra's protests, sharp and escalating in panic, fell flat against the officer's steady commands. Her words were reduced to mere noise under the full weight of the law now pressing down upon her. "You have no right!" she cried, her voice cracking under the strain. But the officer guiding her offered no response. Only the silent firmness of duty performed without bias. Robert, his fight completely extinguished, rose slowly, his shoulders slumped as the cuffs clicked into place around his wrists. His gaze flickered toward David for a fleeting moment before falling away, unable to meet the eyes of the man he had so gravely underestimated. The twins watched in silence, not with gloating or celebration, but with a profound, quiet satisfaction that stemmed from knowing they had stood firm against the storm and refused to be broken. They had answered hate not with fear, but with courage. They had answered violence not with surrender, but with a strength born from years of discipline and the unbreakable bond they shared with their father and with each other. As the Blackwoods were led from the room, their departure heavy with finality, Officer Kessler turned back to the family, a softer tone in his voice. "You've done well," he said, pausing as if carefully choosing his words before adding, "You held your ground with honor. That matters more than you know." David offered no verbal response, needing none. His steady gaze followed the Blackwoods until they disappeared through the exit, swallowed by the system they had believed would protect them, but which had instead revealed their true nature to the world. The station began to settle. Afterward, the frantic energy of the day gradually subsided into a calmer rhythm as officers filed reports and finalized the necessary paperwork. Kessler assured David that the official exoneration documents would be processed within the hour and that the school would also be notified of the findings, though David already knew that battle was one he would gladly see through to its conclusion. Maya and Nicole, though weary from the long hours of questioning and waiting, sat poised and unbowed, their eyes sharp, their shoulders squared as they prepared to leave the station behind, fully aware that while this chapter had closed, the lessons etched into their spirits would never fade. As the three of them stood together, their silhouettes framed against the dimming light filtering through the station's windows, there was a quiet power in their unity, the unspoken promise that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would meet them not as victims of someone else's narrative, but as the authors of their own. They had fought, they had endured, and they had prevailed. The morning sun stretched across the front of Crestwood Academy, casting long beams of light over the familiar paths and polished brick buildings. But today, the light seemed sharper, clearer, as if the very air had been cleansed after a long, bitter storm. The courtyard, once the stage for silent stares and loud, cruel whispers, now carried a different weight, not heavy with menace, but filled with the quiet hum of change, the kind that permeates a place not through loud pronouncements, but through the restless, nervous energy of those who sense a shift in the very ground beneath their feet. Word had spread with surprising speed, carried not by rumor, but by the undeniable facts that had emerged in the aftermath of the Blackwoods arrest and the damning evidence laid bare for all to see. Students who had once laughed alongside Ethan and his friends now gathered in cautious clusters, their voices hushed, their eyes more guarded as they glanced toward the entrance where the twins were expected to return. Teachers who had turned a blind eye to the harassment, who had chosen silence over intervention, now moved with a noticeable stiffness, a quiet shame etched into their faces as they braced themselves for the inevitable reckoning. Inside the administrative office, Principal Harrington stood with his shoulders drawn tight beneath the weight of the cascading events that had befallen his institution. He held in his hands the official reports delivered by the police department, reports that left no room for ambiguity or delay. His gaze lingered over the names listed beneath the bold, clear charges: Ethan Blackwood, Jake Miller, Brandon Hayes, and beside them the final, inescapable recommendation: expulsion, effective immediately. Seated across from him was David Harrison, calm and composed, his posture as steady as it had been at the station, his eyes unwavering as they met the principal's with quiet authority. Beside him, Maya and Nicole sat poised, their uniforms crisp, their faces reflecting the strength of those who had weathered a significant storm and emerged not just standing, but unbent. The board convened early this morning. Harrington began, his voice carrying the strained tone of a man forced to confront his own shortcomings. In light of the investigation's findings and the overwhelming evidence of harassment and assault against your daughters, The suspension has been rescinded, effective immediately. They will return to their classes today." He paused, clearing his throat uncomfortably as he shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening around the edge of the papers. "Furthermore, the students responsible for the harassment and the attack have been expelled permanently." A beat of silence followed, not because it was necessary, but because it felt appropriate to let the weight of the words settle fully before moving forward. David's voice, when he finally spoke, carried no hint of triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only the deep, unwavering calm of a father who had fought for justice and now witnessed its delivery. "It's the decision that should have been made from the outset," he stated plainly, not as an accusation, but as an undeniable truth. Harrington's lips tightened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. Whether regret, embarrassment, or a combination of both, it was impossible to discern. But he nodded, the gesture small yet significant. "We failed your family," he admitted, his voice lower now, roughened by the weight of the truth. "We failed our duty to protect all our students. That will change." Maya's gaze held the principal's with the same clear steadiness that had sustained her through every cruel word, every forceful shove, every attempt to diminish her and her sister. "See that it does," she said, her words measured but firm, leaving no room for empty promises. Beside her, Nicole's voice followed with equal strength. "Not just for us," she added, her eyes sharp and unwavering, "but for every student who doesn't fit your mold." For a moment, Harrington seemed to falter under the weight of their words, but then he offered a shallow nod, the papers trembling slightly in his grasp as he finally set them aside. As they rose from their chairs, David placed a hand lightly on each of his daughter's shoulders, a silent gesture of pride that needed no words to convey its meaning. Together, they stepped out of the office and into the main hallway, their footsteps echoing through the marble corridor that had once felt like a gauntlet, but now felt more like a path cleared by their courage and resilience. Students turned to watch them, some with open curiosity, others with quiet respect, and a few with lingering shame etched into their expressions as they recalled the roles they had played, whether through active participation or passive silence. But no one dared to speak. No one dared to mock or sneer. The gravity of recent events had left them exposed, without any comfortable shadows in which to hide. The twins walked side by side, their heads held high, their shoulders straight, not as returning victims, but as champions of their own narrative, as living proof that resilience in the face of cruelty could shatter even the most formidable walls of prejudice. Outside the building, the morning breeze brushed against their faces, cool and clean, as if the very air acknowledged the shift that had finally occurred. Their father walked beside them, his presence as steadfast as ever, and together they crossed the courtyard, not with haste, but with the deliberate, confident pace of those who had earned every step forward. And as they moved, David's voice, low and sure, broke the quiet between them. "The storm is over," he said, not as a hopeful wish, but as a statement of fact, as certain and unshakable as the sun rising above the horizon. "No," Maya answered, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her tone carrying the quiet strength that had seen her through the fire. "We ended it." Nicole's lips curved into the smallest, fiercest smile, her eyes bright beneath the morning light. "And we'll end it again," she added, "whenever it comes." Together they crossed the threshold of the school, leaving behind the shadows of doubt and stepping fully into the light of justice. Finally, it was done. And though the road ahead would inevitably present challenges, they knew with absolute certainty that whatever storms might arise, they would face them as they had faced this one, together, unbroken and unafraid. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so natural, it almost felt as though the storm had never touched them, as if the winds of cruelty that had once blown so fiercely against their backs had finally subsided into nothing more than a distant memory. Yet, Maya and Nicole never forgot. They didn't carry the weight of what had transpired as a burden, but as something far sharper and far stronger, a constant reminder of their own inner strength, woven into every step they took across the familiar grounds of Crestwood Academy. The school itself seemed subtly transformed, as if it had learned to breathe differently, the atmosphere no longer thick with the unspoken acceptance of cruelty. Teachers, once tight-lipped and quick to avert their gaze, now greeted the twins with a respect that felt earned rather than forced. They called their names in class not with indifference, but with genuine regard, their voices steady, their eyes meeting theirs without the old hesitation. Their classmates, too, had shed the shadows they had once worn so readily. The corridors no longer echoed with mocking laughter or sharp whispers. Instead, there were small but genuine nods of acknowledgement and quiet moments where silence felt like respect rather than avoidance. In the courtyard, where they had once walked under the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, Maya and Nicole now moved freely, their heads held high, their steps unhurried. They often sat beneath the old oak tree during lunch, sunlight warming their faces as they talked about everything and nothing at all, their voices light with the ease of those who no longer had to scrutinize every word, every glance, every breath. It wasn't perfection, because they had never sought that. What they had now was something far more valuable, peace built not on fear, but on strength forged in the crucible of adversity. They understood that the battle they had fought had not only liberated them, but had also initiated a permanent shift in the very core of the school itself. A quiet yet unbreakable change that would endure long after the memory of the Blackwoods faded. Their father's words remained with them, not as distant echoes, but as living truths carried close to their hearts. "Stand your ground," he had told them time and again. And they had done precisely that. Not just for themselves, but for every student who walked those same halls then and would walk them in the future. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the green lawn, the twins sat side by side, their laughter rising easily and naturally, their eyes bright with the simple joy of a day well lived. They had not just survived Crestwood Academy, they had claimed it. And as they looked out over the grounds, at the place that had once tried to shrink them into silence, they saw only the wide-open horizon of the life they had built with their own hands, their own courage, their own unyielding bond. They had won, and they would continue to win every single day. The saga of Maya and Nicole Harrison at Crestwood Academy isn't just a tale of teenage torment and triumphant retaliation. It's a stark reminder of two enduring truths woven into the very fabric of the American spirit. First, it underscores the indomitable power of unwavering resilience in the face of relentless adversity. For weeks, the twins endured a barrage of insults, shoves, and hateful vandalism, each blow designed to erode their dignity and break their spirit. Yet, fueled by their father's unwavering support and their own inner fortitude, they refused to yield. Like a sturdy oak standing firm against hurricane-force winds, their resilience wasn't passive endurance. It was an active, steely resolve that ultimately surprised and overwhelmed their tormentors. This grit, this refusal to back down even when the odds seem stacked against you by a mile, resonates deeply within the American ethos of overcoming challenges and forging your own path. Secondly, the narrative powerfully illustrates the critical importance of standing your ground with courage and conviction when pushed beyond your limits. David Harrison's teachings weren't just about self-defense in the physical sense. They were about cultivating an inner strength that knows when enough is enough. The moment Maya declared, "We're done running," wasn't just a turning point in a schoolyard brawl. It was a declaration of self-respect and a refusal to be victimized any longer. This assertive stance, this willingness to confront injustice head-on, even when facing down bigger, more arrogant adversaries who believe they own the place, speaks to a core American value of fighting for what's right and refusing to be bullied into submission. The Harrison sisters' journey from silent endurance to decisive action serves as a potent reminder that sometimes the only way to weather the storm is to step out into the downpour and fight back, inch by hard-fought inch. Considering Maya and Nicole's powerful stand against injustice at Crestwood Academy, what moments in your own life have demanded that same unwavering resilience and courage to stand your ground? Share your experiences in the comments below. If their story resonated with you and you value narratives of strength and overcoming adversity, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring stories coming your way. Let's connect and build a community that champions resilience.